Close your eyes for a moment and think about the last time you were truly alone. Not just physically alone in a room, but mentally alone. Free from obligations, free from expectations, free from the constant background hum of someone else's needs pressing against your consciousness. For most married men, that moment is so far in the past they can barely remember what it felt like. And yet, it haunts them, in the quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking. In those few seconds before they remember who they're supposed to be today, there's this ghost that visits, the ghost of the man they used to be, the man who could leave for a month on a whim, who could spend entire weekends lost in thought or work or whatever captured his attention without anyone asking where he was or when he'd be back, the man who belonged entirely to himself. And here's what Schopenhauer understood that most philosophers missed. That ghost isn't just nostalgia. It's not just romanticizing the past. It's your deepest self crying out against the prison you've built around it. It's the will, the fundamental life force that Schopenhauer believed drives all existence, thrashing against the chains you've voluntarily wrapped around it in exchange for what everyone promised would be happiness. Every married man dreams of the life he abandoned because that life represented something he can never get back. Not freedom in some abstract philosophical sense, but the concrete, tangible experience of being the sole author of your own existence. And the tragedy isn't that he lost it. The tragedy is that he gave it away willingly, believing the lie that what he was getting in return would be worth it. Right now, somewhere, a married man is sitting in his car in the driveway. He got home from work 15 minutes ago, but he hasn't gone inside yet. He's just sitting there, radio off, engine cooling, staring at nothing. And if you could see inside his head, you'd see him running through an alternate timeline. The timeline where he said no, where he kept his apartment, where he kept his freedom, where he could come home to silence instead of immediate demands, where his time was his own, where his money was his own, where his attention could focus on what mattered to him instead of being constantly fragmented across a dozen domestic concerns. He's not thinking about other women. He's not fantasizing about affairs. He's dreaming about being alone, about the simplicity of solitude, about a life where he didn't have to negotiate every decision or justify every choice or manage someone else's emotions in addition to his own. And then he takes a breath, puts on the mask, and walks inside to be the husband and father everyone expects him to be. This happens thousands of times a day, millions of times a year. It's so common it's almost universal among married men. But nobody talks about it, because admitting it would mean admitting that maybe marriage isn't the fulfillment everyone claims it is. Maybe it's a trade, and maybe, for a lot of men, it's a bad trade. Schopenhauer was possibly the most pessimistic philosopher who ever lived. He looked at human existence and saw suffering, not occasional suffering, not suffering as an aberration, but suffering as the fundamental nature of being alive. And at the root of all this suffering, he identified what he called the will. Not your individual will, your conscious desires, but the will, capital W, the blind, driving force that animates all life, the insatiable wanting that can never be truly satisfied. And according to Schopenhauer, romantic love is one of the will's cruelest tricks. It makes you believe you're choosing your partner, that you're making a decision based on compatibility, attraction, shared values, but you're not. You're being manipulated by the species-level will that cares nothing about your individual happiness and everything about reproduction. The will tricks you into pair bonding by flooding your brain with chemicals that make you believe this particular person is special, is different, is the one, and you fall for it. You mistake the will's reproductive imperative for genuine personal desire. You think you want marriage and family, but what you actually want is to satisfy the restless craving the will has placed in you. And the cruelest part, once the will has gotten what it wants, once you're locked into marriage and kids, the chemicals fade, the magic disappears, and you're left looking at your life wondering how you ended up here. And this is why married men dream of their abandoned lives, because those lives represented a time before the will fully captured them, a time when they could still resist the biological and social programming pushing them toward reproduction and domestication, a time when they belonged to themselves rather than to the species' imperative to propagate. Schopenhauer himself never married, and he was absolutely brutal in his assessment of why. He saw marriage as a trap, as the will's way of ensuring you dedicate your life to creating and raising the next generation regardless of your individual desires. He watched other men fall into this trap and spend the rest of their lives serving interests that weren't their own, working jobs they hated to support families they resented while telling themselves they were happy, and he wanted no part of it. He chose instead what he called the denial of the will, the refusal to participate in the endless cycle of wanting and temporary satisfaction and renewed wanting that defines most human lives. And while his philosophy was dark, while he saw life as fundamentally suffering, he also saw a way out. Through art, through contemplation, through stepping back from the endless striving that the will demands, through being alone with yourself rather than lost in relationships that only deepen your entanglement with desire and suffering. Think about what happens to a man's inner life after marriage. Before marriage, there was space, mental space, emotional space, physical space, time where nothing was demanded of you, where you could let your mind wander, where you could pursue thoughts to their conclusion without interruption, where you could be bored, which sounds negative but is actually essential for creativity and deep thinking, where you could discover what you actually wanted rather than constantly responding to what other people needed. All of that space collapses after marriage. There's always something, always someone who needs you, always a task waiting, always an expectation to meet. Your inner life becomes a luxury you can only afford in stolen moments, and gradually, without really noticing it happening, you lose touch with yourself, with what you actually think and feel and want underneath all the roles you're playing. You become so accustomed to fragmenting your attention that sustained focus becomes almost impossible, so used to considering other people's needs that accessing your own genuine desires becomes difficult. So practiced at being who you need to be for your family, that remembering who you actually are requires conscious effort. And this is what married men are dreaming about when they dream of their abandoned lives. They're not necessarily dreaming about specific things they used to do. They're dreaming about that space, that mental and emotional freedom, that ability to just be without performing, without managing, without constantly attending to someone else. They're dreaming about the simplicity of solitude, about answering only to themselves, about the profound rest that comes from not having to be anything for anyone. Schopenhauer would say they're dreaming about relief from the will's demands, about the brief respite that comes from stepping outside the endless cycle of desire and striving. Because marriage intensifies the will's grip on you, it multiplies your desires and obligations. Before marriage, you only had to satisfy your own needs. After marriage, you're responsible for your spouse's satisfaction, your children's needs, the household's requirements, the social expectations of being a family man. The will has multiplied its demands on you tenfold while giving you less time and energy to meet them. No wonder you're exhausted. No wonder you dream of escape. But here's where Schopenhauer's philosophy becomes really surgical. He argued that happiness isn't achieved by satisfying desires. That's impossible because desire is infinite. Satisfy one and another immediately appears. The will is never satisfied. Instead, the closest thing to happiness is the temporary cessation of wanting. Moments when you're not driven by desire, when you're not striving for anything, when you're not managing obligations, just being. And these moments are incredibly rare in married life, because married life is entirely structured around desire and obligation. Your spouse wants things from you. Your children need things from you. Your job demands things from you to support them all. You're caught in this web of endless wanting and needing and demanding. And the moments of peace, the moments when you could just exist without wanting or being wanted, those have almost entirely disappeared. This is why the abandoned life haunts you. Because in that life, even though you still had desires, you also had space around those desires. Moments of genuine peace. Time when nothing was demanded and nothing was needed and you could just be. Let me describe a specific experience that every married man recognizes but never discusses. It's Sunday morning. You wake up naturally, not to an alarm. For about 30 seconds, you're just awake, just existing. No thoughts, no obligations, no identity, just consciousness. And in those 30 seconds, you feel something you almost never feel anymore. complete peace. But then the thoughts start. What needs to be done today? What your wife mentioned last night about the house? What your kids will want for breakfast? The list of tasks, the obligations, the expectations, and that moment of peace is gone, crushed under the weight of everything you're supposed to be and do, and you feel this ache, this longing for those 30 seconds to extend, to become minutes, hours, days. You want to exist in that space before identity and obligation crash back in. And you remember that you used to live there. That used to be your default state, waking up to nothing but possibility, to time that was yours, to a day you could spend however you wanted. And now it's gone. Not temporarily, permanently, for as long as you're married, for as long as you have these obligations. That space is gone, and you mourn it every Sunday. Every time you get those 30 seconds before remembering who you're supposed to be. Schopenhauer distinguished between two types of pain: the pain of unsatisfied desire and the pain of boredom when desire is temporarily satisfied. And he argued that human life swings between these two like a pendulum. You want something. You suffer from not having it. You get it. You suffer from boredom because the satisfaction is temporary and you immediately want something else. Marriage locks you permanently on the desire side of this pendulum. You're always wanting, always striving, always managing obligations. The boredom that comes from satisfied desire, that's actually a kind of peace. That's the space where you could discover what you actually care about beyond the endless cycle of wanting. But you never get to that space in marriage because there's always another desire, another obligation, another thing that needs handling. You're perpetually in striving mode, never in the peaceful boredom that could lead to genuine insight or creativity or self-discovery. This is another dimension of what you're mourning when you dream of your abandoned life. You're mourning access to boredom, to that supposedly negative state that's actually essential for being human, rather than just being a satisfaction machine. Here's a question that will make you uncomfortable. When was the last time you made a decision based purely on what you wanted without considering anyone else? Not what's best for the family, not what's fair to your spouse, not what's responsible given your obligations, just purely, selfishly, what you wanted. For most married men, that question is almost incomprehensible, because you've so thoroughly internalized the framework of considering others that acting purely from self-interest feels wrong, feels selfish in the bad sense, feels like a betrayal of your commitments. But here's what Schopenhauer would say: that feeling, that inability to even conceive of acting from pure self-interest, that's not virtue. That's not maturity. That's the death of your individual will. That's you having become so completely identified with your obligations that you've forgotten you're a separate being with separate desires. You've merged with your roles: husband, father, provider. And the individual you, the person underneath those roles, has become almost inaccessible even to yourself. And the abandoned life you dream about? That was the last time you had unmediated access to yourself. The last time you could want something without immediately filtering it through layers of obligation and responsibility. The last time you were a complete individual rather than a fragment of a family unit. Schopenhauer believed that individuality was largely an illusion, that the will operates through us without our real consent. But even he recognized that solitude gave you some distance from the will's demands, some space to observe rather than be completely consumed by wanting. And marriage eliminates that space, eliminates that distance. You're fully enmeshed in the will's game, creating the next generation, working to support them, managing desires and obligations. No time for observation, no space for stepping back, just endless participation in the cycle. Let me tell you about the conversations married men have when their wives aren't around. They don't talk about how fulfilled they are. They don't celebrate their marriages. They commiserate. They share war stories about fights and obligations and things they're not allowed to do anymore, and time they don't have and money they can't spend on themselves. And then someone will say something like, "Remember when we could just decide to take a trip? Remember when we could spend Saturday doing absolutely nothing? Remember when our time was our own?" And everyone gets quiet, because they're all thinking about it, about the freedom they used to have, about the simplicity of their abandoned lives, about how much easier everything was when they only had to manage themselves, And then someone makes a joke, changes the subject. Because if they stayed with that thought too long, if they really examined how much they miss their old lives, they'd have to confront some very uncomfortable truths about their current ones. They'd have to admit that maybe they're not as happy as they claim. Maybe they made a trade they regret. Maybe the life they're living isn't actually the life they wanted, but just the life they accepted, because that's what you're supposed to do. Schopenhauer had this concept he called the hedonic treadmill before that term existed. The idea that humans adapt to their circumstances and return to a baseline level of happiness or unhappiness, regardless of what happens. You get what you think you want, and it makes you happy briefly. Then you adapt and you're back to baseline and wanting something else. And marriage is the perfect illustration of this. You think getting married will make you happy. And maybe it does, briefly. But then you adapt, the novelty wears off, and you're back to baseline. Except now you have all these new obligations and restrictions. So you're not actually happier. You've just added complexity and limitation to your life without any lasting increase in well-being. And you can't admit this. Can't even fully think it. Because admitting it would mean admitting you made a massive mistake. That you gave up freedom for nothing. That the trade you made was objectively bad. So you tell yourself you're happy. You focus on the good moments and ignore the background hum of dissatisfaction. You convince yourself this is what you wanted. And you push down the dreams of your abandoned life because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging the truth. Here's what actually happens to desire in marriage. Before marriage, your desires were your own. You wanted to travel, so you traveled. You wanted to change careers, so you changed careers. You wanted to spend money on something, so you spent it. Your desires led directly to action with no intermediary. But in marriage, desire becomes negotiation. You want something, but you can't just act on it. You have to discuss it with your spouse. Consider how it affects the family. Make sure it's fair given what your spouse gets. Justify the expense or time commitment. Get approval. And through this process, your desires get filtered, compromised, often eliminated entirely. You learn to not want things that won't pass through the filter. You learn to self-censor your desires before they're even fully formed. Gradually, you lose touch with what you actually want because you've become so accustomed to only acknowledging wants that are permissible within the marriage framework. Your desire has been domesticated, neutered, and when you dream of your abandoned life, you're dreaming of unfiltered desire, of wanting something and just doing it, of that direct connection between impulse and action that made you feel alive and autonomous and real. Schopenhauer believed that romantic love was nature's trick to propagate the species. That you think you're choosing a partner based on love when really you're being driven by genetic imperatives to create optimal offspring. And once the trick has worked, once you're locked in with children, the love fades because nature doesn't need it anymore. It served its purpose. And this is why long-term marriage often feels less like love and more like a business partnership or roommate situation. The intense feeling that brought you together is gone. What remains is obligation, habit, shared logistics. You're co-managing a household and raising children. But the spark, the magic, the feeling that made you think this person was special and different and the one, that's evaporated. And you can't help but wonder if the whole thing was a con. If you were sold a false bill of goods. If what you thought was love was just biology manipulating you into making choices that benefit genetic propagation rather than your individual happiness. And when you dream of your abandoned life, part of what you're dreaming about is freedom from this biological programming. Freedom from the imperatives that drove you into marriage in the first place. When you were single, you could see women clearly, could evaluate them as individuals, could choose to engage or not based on what you actually wanted, rather than what your biology was screaming at you to want. But once the biology got its hooks in, once you fell in love, as they say, your judgment was compromised. You made decisions you wouldn't have made with a clear head. You committed to things that didn't actually serve your interests. And now you're living with the consequences. And you can't help but feel, in your more honest moments, that you were tricked. That the person making those decisions wasn't really you. It was your biology using you as a vehicle for its own purposes. Let me tell you about the fantasy that plays in almost every married man's head at some point. It's not sexual. It's not about other women. It's this. Something happens. Maybe his spouse dies suddenly and painlessly. Maybe she leaves him. Maybe some external circumstance beyond his control ends the marriage without him having to make the decision. And his first feeling, before the guilt sets in, before he remembers he's supposed to be devastated, is relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. Because suddenly he's free. The obligations are gone. The constant negotiation is gone. His time is his own again. His money is his own. His attention can focus where he wants it. He can make decisions without consulting anyone, can come and go as he pleases, can structure his life according to his own priorities rather than family needs. And in the fantasy, he doesn't remarry, doesn't get into another relationship. He stays single, stays free, finally gets back the life he abandoned. And here's the thing about this fantasy. Almost every married man has some version of it, but almost none will admit it. Because admitting it means admitting that freedom matters more to them than the marriage. That given the choice, they'd choose solitude over partnership. That the life they're living isn't actually the life they'd choose if they could choose freely. Schopenhauer wrote about the wisdom of saying no to the will's demands, of denying desire rather than satisfying it, of recognizing that the cycle of wanting and wanting more is endless suffering, and stepping off the cycle entirely. And from his perspective, the unmarried life isn't selfish, it's wise. It's recognizing that marriage and family are the will's primary tools for keeping you trapped in the cycle, for ensuring you never have the peace that comes from reduced desire, for making sure you're always striving, always wanting, always working to satisfy needs that multiply faster than you can meet them. The man who stays single, who lives simply, who reduces his desires to what he can easily satisfy, that man has stepped off the hedonic treadmill. He's found a measure of peace that married men can only dream about. Literally. Because they do dream about it. They dream about the simplicity, the quiet, the absence of constant demands, the ability to just be without constantly becoming. Here's another dimension of this that nobody discusses. The erosion of privacy in marriage. Before marriage, your inner life was yours. Your thoughts were private. Your feelings were your own business, unless you chose to share them. You had space to process things internally before deciding whether to express them externally. But marriage eliminates that privacy. Your spouse expects access to your inner life, expects you to share your thoughts and feelings, expects emotional transparency and vulnerability. And if you try to maintain some private interior space, you're accused of being closed off, of not being emotionally available, of having intimacy issues. So you learn to make your inner life accessible, to explain yourself, to process your feelings out loud with your spouse as audience and participant. And something essential is lost. That private self, that inner sanctum where you could be completely honest with yourself without performing for anyone. That space shrinks and eventually almost disappears. And you don't even notice it's gone until you're driving home one day and you realize you can't remember the last time you had a thought you didn't have to explain to someone. The life you abandoned had privacy, had mental and emotional space that was solely yours. You could think things without sharing them, feel things without explaining them, process your inner experience without making it available for inspection and discussion. And when you dream of that life, you're dreaming of that privacy, of that inner fortress that was yours alone, of the relief of not having to make every aspect of your consciousness accessible to someone else. Schopenhauer valued solitude precisely because it provided this privacy, this space to think without obligation, to share those thoughts, to experience your own consciousness without constantly having to translate it for someone else's understanding. Marriage makes genuine solitude almost impossible. Even when you're physically alone, you're mentally accompanied, thinking about your spouse, your obligations, what you need to handle when you get home. The solitude that allows for deep contemplation, for genuine self-encounter, that requires more than physical aloneness. It requires mental space, and marriage fills that space completely. Let me tell you what happens to ambition after marriage. Before marriage, ambition was pure. You wanted to achieve something for its own sake, for the satisfaction of achievement, for the challenge, for the growth it required. But after marriage, ambition becomes instrumental. You're ambitious not for the sake of the work itself, but because you need to earn more money to support your family, because you need status to make your wife proud, because you need to provide opportunities for your children. The intrinsic motivation gets replaced by extrinsic pressure, and something dies. The joy in the work dies. The pure satisfaction of pursuing excellence for its own sake dies. What remains is obligation dressed up as ambition. And you can feel the difference even if you can't articulate it. Work that used to energize you now drains you, because you're not doing it for yourself anymore. You're doing it for everyone else. And when you dream of your abandoned life, you're dreaming of pure ambition, of working on something because you want to, not because you have to, of pursuing excellence as its own reward rather than as a means to meet obligations. Schopenhauer believed that suffering could only be reduced, never eliminated, that the best we could do was minimize desire and find brief moments of peace in aesthetic contemplation or intellectual work. And he saw relationships, especially marriage, as multiplying rather than reducing suffering, because now you're responsible not just for your own satisfaction, but for your spouse's, your children's, your whole family's. You've multiplied the sources of potential suffering while reducing your capacity to find peace. The unmarried man can reduce his desires to almost nothing, can live simply, can find satisfaction in small things, can spend his time in contemplation or creative work that provides temporary escape from the will's demands. But the married man has no such option. His desires are multiplied by his obligations. He can't reduce his needs because other people depend on him. He can't withdraw into contemplation because he has responsibilities. He's trapped in the cycle of endless striving with no escape. And this is the core of what married men mourn when they dream of their abandoned lives. They're not mourning specific experiences or freedoms, though those matter. They're mourning peace, the possibility of peace. The unmarried life, for all its challenges, contained the possibility of stepping off the hedonic treadmill, of finding some measure of tranquility, of reducing desire until it became manageable. But marriage eliminates that possibility. You're on the treadmill for life, running faster and faster to meet ever-expanding obligations, and the only rest comes when you're too exhausted to continue. That's not peace, that's just collapse. And deep down, you know it. You know you've traded the possibility of genuine peace for the false promise of happiness through relationship. And you can't help but wonder if solitude, with all its challenges, might have been the wiser choice. Here's what nobody tells you before marriage. The self you're bringing to the altar is the best self you'll ever be within that marriage. Because marriage doesn't make you better. It makes you busier, more obligated, more fragmented, more exhausted. Whatever self-improvement you were going to do, whatever growth you were planning to achieve, that needs to happen before the wedding. Because after you're in maintenance mode. You're managing decline, not enabling growth. You're trying to keep what you have rather than pursuing what you could become. And the man you could have been, the heights you could have reached if you'd stayed focused on your own development, that man haunts you. That man appears in your dreams of the life you abandoned. Because you know, somewhere deep where you don't like to look, that you stopped growing the day you got married. That you capped your potential. That you chose comfort over greatness. And you can't undo it. Schopenhauer saw clearly what most people refuse to see. That life is suffering. That desire is endless. That satisfaction is temporary. And that the only rational response is to minimize participation in the cycle. To want less. To need less. To find what peace you can in moments of aesthetic contemplation or intellectual work that temporarily lifts you above the endless wanting. And marriage is the opposite of this wisdom. Marriage is diving deeper into desire, multiplying your needs, ensuring you never have the peace that comes from withdrawal. It's choosing suffering because society tells you that's what you're supposed to choose. That's what will make you happy. But it doesn't make you happy. It makes you busy enough that you don't notice you're unhappy. It gives you obligations that distract you from the fundamental dissatisfaction. And it works. Most married men die without ever acknowledging how unhappy they were, without ever admitting that the dreams of their abandoned lives weren't just nostalgia, but glimpses of a truth they couldn't afford to face. So here's what I want you to understand. If you're married and you dream of the life you abandoned, you're not broken. You're not ungrateful. You're not failing at marriage. You're experiencing the natural consequence of having made a trade that didn't work in your favor. You gave up freedom, privacy, peace, and the possibility of greatness. And in return, you got companionship, social approval, and a family. For some men, that's a good trade. But for many, maybe most, it's not. And the dreams are your deepest self telling you the truth that your conscious mind can't afford to acknowledge, that you made a mistake, that you want out, that if you could do it over, you'd choose differently. And I'm not telling you to get divorced. I'm telling you to stop lying to yourself about what you actually want. Stop pretending the dreams don't mean anything. Stop dismissing your own dissatisfaction as immaturity or selfishness. Your unhappiness is real. Your longing for the life you abandoned is legitimate. And honoring that truth, even if you can't act on it, is the first step toward any kind of genuine peace. I want to hear from you right now. Drop a comment with this exact phrase, "I honor my truth." Because saying it, even in a comment section, is a small act of acknowledging what you actually feel instead of what you're supposed to feel. It's you admitting that the dreams matter, that your dissatisfaction is real, that you're not going to keep lying to yourself about being happy when you're not. Write "I honor my truth" in the comments right now. Subscribe to this channel because we're exploring the philosophical depths of choices everyone makes without really understanding what they're choosing. We're examining the costs that nobody talks about. We're building a community of men who value truth over comfortable lies and self-knowledge over social approval. Hit that like button because content that exposes the reality of married life, rather than the fantasy, that validates the feelings men have but never express, that takes courage to create and you're like, shows there's hunger for this level of honesty. What's coming next will shatter your understanding of happiness itself. I'm going to reveal how the pursuit of happiness is designed to keep you perpetually dissatisfied, how the very concept of happiness is a trap that ensures you never find what you're actually looking for, and why the men who give up on happiness entirely are the only ones who find any measure of peace. Subscribe now because this next video will change how you see every choice you've made in pursuit of what you thought would make you happy, and you'll realize you've been chasing an illusion that was never meant to be caught.